Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff. In today's video, we are sort of going back to the basics of sublimation, and we're going to be talking about how to find the right time, temperature, and pressure settings for your heat press. If you are new to sublimation, you may find it completely overwhelming, and that's understandable. Sublimation has a lot of variables, so it all depends on the blank you're using, the paper you're using, the type of printer you're using, the humidity in the air. And then there are also the variables of time, temperature, and pressure when it comes to your heat press. So today we're going to talk about those three variables of time, temperature, and pressure and see how they work together to give you a really good sublimation print. And then we are also going to troubleshoot if the time, temperature, and pressure given to you by the manufacturer isn't working for you. For this video, I'm using my Press from Heat Transfer Warehouse, but all of the tips and tricks in this video can be used on basically any type of press you have. That includes something as simple as a Cricut Easy Press, a sublimation oven. All of these time, temperature, and pressure variables exist with basically any type of heat press you have, so you should be able to use the tips and tricks in this video to make your projects even better. If you come from a cutting machine world, so Cricut or Silhouette, you may be used to having your temperature settings for your heat press based on your material. So for example, I have two different materials here. I have just a regular iron-on and then I have a glitter iron-on. And the time, temperature, and pressure settings for these are going to be different. But in sublimation, your time, temperature, and pressure settings are based on your blank. So all of your prints out of your printer are basically going to be the same. They may be different sizes and different images, but it's all just a print from your printer. So the time, temperature, and pressure settings are going to be based on the blank. So for example, what you are using for pressing a tumbler like this, a metal tumbler, is going to be completely different than what you are using when you are pressing something like this sublimation pot holder. Generally, if you're buying from a reputable dealer, you should be getting those time, temperature, and pressure settings within the listing for the item that you are buying. So if you are buying from Heat Transfer Warehouse or Heat Press Nation or any of those sorts of distributors, they always have a section within their website where you can see what settings you need to use. If you're buying off Amazon or another large marketplace, it's really hit or miss. There are some brands that are really good about giving you your settings within that purchase listing, and there are some that don't give it to you at all. So for example, PYD Life, it's a brand I use a lot. They generally have all the settings in their Amazon listing. I just bought a whole bunch of pet products that I'm going to be using in another video, and almost none of those had listings, so it was very annoying. But if you can't find the time, temperature, and pressure settings for a particular blank, don't worry, we're going to cover that later in this video. Let's talk a little bit more about each of the individual elements here. So first up is time. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as dwell time. Basically, it is the amount of time that the plate of your heat press is actually touching your blank. This can range from as low as something like 30 seconds, well up past 10 minutes, depending on what you're pressing. My biggest tip when it comes to time is to always use the countdown feature of your heat press. The last thing you want to do is have no idea how long something has been pressing, or even worse, forget that you are pressing something. And then there is temperature. So the baseline temperature for sublimation is somewhere between 350 degrees to just over 400 degrees. And it really does vary depending on what blank you're using. You want to make sure that you are letting your heat press or your sublimation oven heat up all the way before you add your blank to your press. You also may notice when you close your press or you go to put your Easy Press on a project that the temperature goes down. And that's because the heated plate of your heat press is hitting this bottom plate, which is not heated, or it's hitting the Easy Press mat, and it's basically cooling down the plate of your press. If you have a longer pressing time, over 2 minutes, this generally doesn't matter because your press will work its way back up to temperature. But if you have something that you're pressing for a shorter amount of time, you may want to bump your press up another 5-10 degrees to sort of compensate for when you close that press for it losing some of that heat. And then there is pressure. This is probably the least understood of the three elements, and so we're going to go a little bit more into detail here. Most manual presses are going to have some sort of a crank to adjust the pressure. So my crank is up here on top of my press. If I crank it to the right, it increases the pressure. If I crank it to the left, it decreases the pressure. If you don't have a regular sort of manual press, there are a couple other options that you might have. The first is an auto press, like the Cricut auto press, the Vever auto press, or the HTV Ron auto press. These presses automatically apply pressure, and for the most part, they do a good job. But if you are working on a project that needs heavy pressure, it can be a little bit more difficult to get that right. I recently did a video on how to sublimate slate in an auto press, and it's actually difficult because it needs heavy pressure, and the auto press is just sort of giving you this nice medium pressure. So if your projects are coming out faded in your auto press, there are a few things that you can try. The first is you can add something like this wool mat to your press. So this is basically a thick piece of wool. I think it's meant for pressing with an iron when you're sewing, but it's really, really sturdy. And because of that, The Easy Press mat sort of squashes down. This does not. So you do get a little bit more pressure when you're using a mat like this. And then another option is to use the Sublimation green pad. And I'm so sorry, friends, there is no alternative to this. And yes, it is just way too expensive. But there is basically metal fibers woven into this rubber, which means that it conducts heat really well and becomes just as hot as the top plate of your heat press. And then, because it's rubber, it conforms to basically any uneven surface and it just presses things really nicely. So again, very expensive. However, if you're really getting into sublimation, this might be one of those things that you want to purchase. If you want to see those two pads in action, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link to the post I did on sublimating slate in an AutoPress. In addition to sort of a regular press or an auto press, you might also have a sublimation oven. And of course you need pressure in a sublimation oven, but the oven itself doesn't provide the pressure. This is where silicone sleeves or shrink wrap come in. I have tried the silicone sleeves. I do not like them. There are people that they work for, but I have just not had really good results, so I always fall back on shrink wrap. Basically, the shrink wrap is going to shrink around your object and create the pressure that you need to sublimate. Again, I have a whole video on sublimating tumblers using shrink wrap in an oven, so I will go ahead and link to that video down in the description. Now, projects might need light, medium, or heavy pressure. And if you're looking at your heat press going, I don't know what any of those are, I'm gonna give you a little tip. So the first is to grab yourself a piece of copy paper. This is a piece of butcher paper. And to find light pressure, you're basically gonna turn the crank so that when you close the press, you can pull this out. You don't want it to just fly out. You wanna have a little bit of resistance, but you'll be able to pull it out with light pressure. So I have set my heat press to light pressure, which means that when I pull this, you can see that I am getting some resistance, but I can pull it out. And then let's go to the other end and talk about heavy pressure. So with heavy pressure, you basically want to be able to close your press, but just barely. And so to do that, I usually find the point in my heat press where I can't quite close it. So if I'm gonna stand up here, and you'll see here that I can't quite close my press. But if I turn my crank so that I lessen the pressure just a little bit, I should be able to close my press with a little bit of elbow grease, and it should work. That is the feeling you're going for with heavy pressure. Obviously, this will change when you have an actual blank in there. The amount of heavy pressure for a slate, for example, versus a very flat bookmark is going to be very different where you have this setting. So you can't just set it as heavy pressure because it is going to change depending on your blank, but you do want to get that feel. You want to be able to say, okay, this is heavy pressure because it does take a little bit of elbow grease to close. And then medium pressure is somewhere between those two. And that's generally where most projects are. So you will kind of get a feel for it over time, but I lessen the pressure just a little bit from the heavy pressure, and now I put my paper back in there and I can't pull it out. That means I'm not all the way to light pressure, but I am at a nice medium pressure. So like I said earlier in this video, your best bet is to start with the manufacturer's time, temperature, and pressure settings. Often they'll be great. If you can't find the settings from the manufacturer, find a similar blank online that does have settings and start there. Unfortunately, even the manufacturer settings may not work for you. Maybe they're not right overall. Maybe your variables are different. Maybe you have more humidity in your room, or maybe your paper is old, or there's just so many variables that can mess with sublimation that this manufacturer's recommended settings may not actually work for you. So in the 3 variables, the number 1 variable that I play with when it comes to trying to fix my sublimation projects is time. You can play with the pressure a little bit. You can add a little bit more pressure if you are seeing faded images. You can increase the temperature, although I generally don't recommend it unless you're really starting at a lower temperature. That is because you can burn your projects and you just really don't want an ugly sort of yellowy brown project. It can also really mess with shrink wrap. So if you are doing something in an oven and you bump the temperature up really high, that shrink wrap gets really ugly really fast and very difficult to remove. So instead I play with the time. So you can start by adding time, 30-second increments, 60-second increments, depending on what type of blank you're using. For example, I was making a slate the other day and the manufacturer said 240 seconds. I had got it all the way up to 480 seconds before I was happy with the end result. There are also a bunch of other problems that can mess with your sublimation projects that are not related to time, temperature, and pressure. I did a whole video on troubleshooting your sublimation projects, so I will go ahead and link to that as well, just in case you are having an issue that doesn't have to do with these settings. And that's it. I hope you found this video on time, temperature, and pressure helpful. It is one of those things that when you're first starting out, you may not understand how they sort of all work together to give you you the perfect sublimation project, but the more sublimation you do, the more you'll start to see patterns. You'll start to see, okay, these blanks are usually about this temperature for this long, and these are this temperature for this long. You'll understand how the different pressure feels in your press. All of these things just come as you sublimate more. If you found this video helpful, of course, I would appreciate a like. Follow my channel for more sublimation, Cricut, and laser content. I'll see you next time.